Daniel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He thought of her silver skin catching the kitchen light. He thought of her violet eyes, watching him carefully with every bite. He thought of the warmth of her hand when she touched his across the table. He couldn't stay away any longer. The silence was worse than the risk. The emptiness was worse than the pain of what might come. Daniel set the note carefully beside the tray, as if it were something precious, and stood. His heart pounded as he stepped into the corridor, walking toward her door. For the first time in days, his fist rose to knock, and in that single moment, Daniel understood something deeply human, something powerful. Love wasn't about how long it lasted. Love was about choosing it, even if it hurt, and he was ready to choose. Daniel stood outside her door, his hand still raised after knocking. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. What if she didn't want to see him? What if her people's warning had already convinced her to stay away? But before the thought could take root, the door opened. Soraya stood there, her violet eyes wide, her lips parting in surprise. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled with everything unsaid over the past days. Then, slowly, her shoulders softened. She stepped aside. "Come in," she whispered. Daniel entered, and his breath caught. The table was covered, truly covered, with more dishes than he had ever seen in her home. Soups, breads, stews, pies, even small delicate pastries. Some looked perfect, golden, and inviting. Others were misshapen, strange in color, or clearly overcooked. But together, they created a picture more beautiful than any banquet he had ever known. It wasn't food. It was memory. It was effort. It was love written in flour, broth, and fire. "I wanted to show you," Soraya said softly, her hands trembling as she motioned toward the table. "Every dish, it is a memory you gave me. Every recipe, every story, they are not just food anymore. They are pieces of you." Daniel's throat tightened. He moved closer, staring at the collection. He saw her first attempt at bread, slightly burnt, just like the one she had left at his door. He saw her soups, each flavored differently, some too sharp, some too mild. He saw the strange pie that had once made him cough, now sitting proudly among the others. She had remembered everything. "Soraya." His voice broke. He had no words, big enough for what he felt. She looked down, as if afraid of his answer. "In my people's way," she continued, her voice unsteady, "we do not give rings, we do not kneel, we cook. To cook is to bind life to another, to share hunger and warmth until one cannot be without the other." Her hands clenched together. She was trembling, but she didn't stop. "Daniel, will you share your hunger with me? Until the end of your days?" The words hit him like a wave. For a moment, he could only stare at her, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break, free from his chest. He had known there was something between them, but to hear her speak it aloud, to hear her offer herself in the deepest way her people understood, it was overwhelming. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Soraya, are you sure? I'm human. My life is short compared to yours. One day I'll grow old. I'll fade." Her eyes lifted to his, glistening with something he had never seen from her before. Fear and hope tangled together. "Then I will treasure the years I have with you, even if they are few." Daniel felt his breath catch. He thought of all the warnings, all the doubts. He thought of Carter's sneer, of the Veyari's scolding words. He thought of the silence, the emptiness of his own unit. And then he thought of her laughter, her quiet touch, her table full of imperfect meals made only for him. He reached out, taking her cool hands in his warm ones. "Soraya," he said softly, "you don't have to live my whole life. Just live it with me, that's enough." Her lips parted, trembling. For the first time, she let herself smile fully, a real smile that softened her entire face. She exhaled shakily and leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against his chest. Daniel felt her heartbeat. Steady, sure, different from his, yet somehow perfectly in rhythm with his own. That night they sat together at the feast. They ate slowly, tasting each dish, laughing at the failures, admiring the successes. Every bite carried more than flavor. It carried a promise that no matter how different their worlds were, no matter how long or short their lives, they would face it together. By the time the table was empty, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. The night hadn't just been a meal. It had been a proposal, and his answer was yes. The night of the feast lingered in Daniel's mind long after the dishes were cleared away. He could still see the table filled with memories, still taste the sweetness of her bread, still feel the way her cool hands trembled in his. But above all, he could still hear her words. "Will you share your hunger with me? Until the end of your days?" It was not the kind of proposal humans made. There were no rings, no kneeling, no rehearsed speeches. And yet, for Daniel, it was more powerful than any ceremony he had ever imagined. Because it came from her, from Soraya, who had crossed the lines of her own people's traditions, who had dared to feel something they warned her against, who had offered him not just food, but her life. That night, when he finally left her unit, he lay awake in his bed staring at the ceiling. But unlike the lonely nights before, he did not feel empty. His chest was full of fear, full of hope, full of love. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual. The colony streets were quiet, the copper sky just beginning to brighten. He walked past the supply depot, past the markets, until he found a small stall run by a group of older human settlers. They sold little pieces of earth they had managed to keep alive, scraps of fabric, jars of herbs, even an old wooden spoon. Daniel bought one of the jars, flour, grown carefully. In the colony's gardens, rare and expensive. He carried it back with care, his heart pounding the whole way. That evening, instead of waiting for the smell of her cooking, Daniel knocked on Soraya's door with his own hands full. When she opened it, her eyes widened. "Daniel?" He lifted the jar, awkward but determined. "Tonight I'll cook for you." Her lips parted in surprise. For a moment she only stared. Then slowly she stepped aside and let him in. Inside, Daniel set to work. He was not skilled like her. His movements were clumsy, his hands unsure. But Soraya stayed close, watching, silently, her eyes soft. Together they worked in the warmth of her kitchen, mixing, kneading, laughing when the flour puffed up into the air and coated his face. When at last he pulled the small loaf from her oven, it was crooked, uneven, and barely held together, but the smell, it was real. The smell of earth, the smell of home. Daniel placed it on the table, his heart racing. "It's not perfect," he admitted, "but it's mine, and I want to share it with you. Always." Soraya reached out, touching the bread gently, as if it were something sacred. Her eyes lifted to his, shimmering with emotion. In that moment, Daniel didn't need to kneel, didn't need a ring. His words were enough. His heart was enough. "Soraya," he said, his voice steady but full of feeling. "I don't care how short my life is compared to yours. I don't care about the warnings or what anyone else says. All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel alive. I want to spend every day I have, whether it's years or just moments, sitting at this table with you. Will you let me?" For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then Soraya stepped closer, placing her cool hand against his cheek. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, Daniel, I will share your hunger, until your last breath, and beyond." His chest ached with relief and happiness. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat against his. For the first time, it didn't matter that they were different. It didn't matter that one life would be shorter than the other. What mattered was now. What mattered was choice. That night, they ate the uneven bread together. Each bite was filled, With laughter, with promises, with love. To anyone else, it might have looked small and ordinary. But to them, it was everything. Two neighbors had become partners. Two strangers had become family. And in the quiet warmth of that room, their story began. Not with rings or vows, but with bread, with courage, and with the simple human act of choosing love. Because sometimes humanity's greatest strength isn't its power, its weapons, or its knowledge. Sometimes it is the way it teaches others that food can carry memory, that meals can carry meaning, and that love can be born across any distance, even between stars. That was the night Daniel and Sariah promised each other forever, and it all began with a loaf of bread. One evening, as the two of them sat together over a bowl of stew, Daniel told her a story about winters on Earth. He spoke of snow falling in silence, of windows fogging with warmth, of how his mother used to make hot soup while he and his siblings played outside. Sariah listened intently, her chin resting on her hand. Her expression was soft, her eyes shimmering with something he couldn't quite name. When he finished, she reached across the table and touched his hand. Daniel froze. Her skin was cooler than his, smooth and almost metallic to the touch. But the gesture carried a warmth that went far deeper than temperature. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice quieter than ever. "Do humans always share so much of themselves when they eat together?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Not always. Only with someone who matters." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, she looked almost vulnerable. "Someone who matters," she repeated softly, as if tasting the words. The air between them changed after that night. It wasn't something they spoke about, but it was there, like a quiet current flowing beneath the surface. Daniel began to notice how she lingered near him even after the meal was done, how she found small reasons to keep him at the table. He began to notice how she touched things differently when he was there, slower, gentler, almost as if she was careful with every move. He also saw her hesitate sometimes. There were moments when her gaze turned distant, when her hands tightened around a dish, when she almost looked afraid. Daniel knew the Veyari were not known for emotions. Their people were logical, structured, always careful with bonds. To care, too much was seen as weakness. And yet here she was, breaking that unspoken rule one shared meal at a time. Daniel's heart was caught between joy and worry. Joy because every evening with her felt like healing. Worry because he wasn't sure how far this could go. She was Veyari. He was human. Her people lived for centuries while he had only decades. What could someone like her want with someone like him? But every time doubt rose in his mind, she would glance at him in that quiet way of hers, and the doubts melted. One night, after finishing another attempt at bread, this one softer and closer to perfection, Sariah placed the last piece on his plate, pushing it toward him gently. "You always give me the biggest piece," Daniel said with a chuckle. "Of course," she answered simply, her tone steady but her eyes glowing faintly. "It belongs to you." The words struck him harder than he expected. He stared at her, searching her face, but she said nothing more. Daniel went to bed that night restless. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled. He had come to her home because of the smell of bread. But now he realized he wasn't staying for the food anymore. He was staying for her. And though neither of them had spoken it aloud, Daniel knew something had already begun between them. Something fragile, something dangerous, but something beautiful. The stirring of feelings had already taken root. And whether they admitted it or not, both Daniel and Sariah were no longer just neighbors. They were something more. For a while, Daniel almost believed nothing could go wrong. His days were still long and tiring, but every evening ended with warmth, laughter, and Sariah's company. She had become the light in his routine, the thing he looked forward to when everything else felt heavy. But the world outside her door was not as kind. One evening, Daniel stepped out of her unit after dinner. His stomach was full, his heart even more so, and a faint smile lingered on his face. The corridor was dim, lit only by the dull blue strips along the walls. He had barely taken 3 steps before a voice broke the silence. "Careful, Dan." He turned. It was Carter, one of his co-workers from the supply depot. Carter leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression sharp with disapproval. Daniel frowned. "Careful of what?" Carter's lip curled. "Don't play dumb. Everyone sees it. You spend half your nights in there eating with her. You're getting too cozy." Daniel's chest tightened. "So what if I am? It's none of your business." Carter pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "It is my business when you're forgetting what they are. They're not like us, Dan. They don't feel the way we do. They don't love. They use people. That's all you'll ever be to her. Some curiosity. Some project." Daniel clenched his fists. His first instinct was to argue, to defend Soraya, but Carter's words sank deeper than he wanted to admit. What if there was truth in them? What if Soraya only saw him as something fleeting, something temporary? He didn't answer. He just brushed past Carter and went into his own unit, but the words stayed with him like a thorn. The very next evening, Daniel noticed something different at Soraya's door. Another Veyari stood there, tall and cold, speaking to her in their native tongue. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was sharp, almost scolding. Soraya's shoulders were stiff, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. When the other Veyari finally left, Soraya stood in silence for a moment before opening her door to Daniel. He stepped inside quietly, unsure if he should ask, but the weight in her eyes told him he had to. "What was that about?" he asked softly. Soraya didn't answer right away. She placed a dish on the table, her movements slower than usual, her hands trembling just slightly. Finally she spoke. "They say it is unwise." Daniel frowned. "Unwise?" Her violet eyes met his, full of hesitation. "Humans live short lives. You burn quickly, like fire. They say if I care for you, I will only know pain. That, it will end too soon." Daniel's chest ached. He wanted to reach for her to tell her they were wrong, but the words caught in his throat. Because deep down, he knew there was truth in what she said. He would grow old in decades. She could live for centuries. How could something so fragile survive that kind of difference? That night, dinner was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel ate slowly, unable to taste the food. Soraya barely touched her own plate. The warmth that usually filled the table was gone, replaced by an invisible wall between them. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door but didn't say anything. Her hand almost lifted as if she wanted to touch his arm, but she let it fall back to her side. Daniel returned to his own unit and sat in the dark, the silence pressing down on him. Carter's words echoed in his mind. The warning from her people echoed too. They don't love like we do. It will only end in pain. For the first time since that first night of bread, Daniel wondered if he was a fool. Maybe this was doomed before it even began. Maybe the warmth he had found was only temporary, destined to fade. But even as doubt filled his chest, another truth gnawed at him just as strongly. Temporary or not, he didn't want to let her go. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Daniel still walked past Soraya's door every evening, but he did not knock. He wanted to. Oh, how badly he wanted to. But the memory of her words pressed on him like a weight. Humans live short lives. It will end too soon. He told himself it was better this way. Better to cut the bond before it grew too deep. Better for her. Better for him. At least, that's what he tried to believe. But his small unit felt colder than ever. The nutrient packs tasted like dust in his mouth. He ate them because his body needed the fuel, but every bite reminded him of what he had lost. The warmth of her table, the sound of her voice, the way she leaned forward when he spoke as if his words mattered. Now there was only silence. At work, Carter noticed the change. "Told you?" he muttered one day, tossing a crate onto the floor. "Best not to get too close. They don't stick around." Daniel didn't answer. He just kept working, jaw tight, heart heavier with every passing hour. Nights were the worst. He would lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the building. Sometimes, faintly, he thought he could still smell bread, drifting from across the hall. It made his chest ache. He wanted to believe she was cooking, that she was sitting alone at her table, maybe thinking of him too. But he never went to check. Then one evening, everything changed. Daniel came home from another long shift. His body was sore, his spirit even more so. He pushed open the door to his unit and stopped. Something was there. A small tray rested on the floor just outside his door. On it sat a loaf, misshapen, burned at the edges, uneven, clearly rushed, clearly imperfect, and beneath it lay a note. Daniel's heart raced as he bent down, picking it up carefully. The handwriting was uneven, her human letters shaky, but the meaning was clear. I tried. Without you here, the taste is wrong. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, holding the note, staring at the bread. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. He sat down on the floor, the tray still in his hands, and laughed bitterly, through the sting of tears. So she had felt it too. The silence, the emptiness. It wasn't just food anymore. It had never been just food. Daniel placed the tray inside his unit and sat at his table, staring at the imperfect loaf. His chest hurt, but not in the way Carter had warned him about. This wasn't about weakness or being used. This was about someone trying so hard to hold on to something fragile, even if the world said it couldn't last. With shaking hands, he tore off a piece and bit into it. It was burnt, bitter at the edges, far from the sweet softness of her earlier loaves. But to Daniel, it was the best thing he had tasted in weeks, because it carried more than flavor. It carried a message. Message that said, I miss you, I need you here. Daniel had lived on the colony world for almost 3 years, yet it never truly felt like home. The sky was different here, painted in shades of copper and violet that made him long for Earth's soft blues. The air was thicker too, always carrying a faint metallic tang. Every day felt like survival, not living. He went to work at the supply depot, returned to his small unit in the shared housing block, ate bland nutrient packs, and went to bed. That was his life, repeated again and again, each day blurring into the next. But one evening, something broke the cycle. It started with a smell. He was walking back through the narrow corridor of the housing block, his boots echoing on the metal floor, when the air shifted. For the first time in years, Daniel smelled something warm, something familiar, something that pulled at his chest like a memory he had almost forgotten. It was soft and rich, carrying a sweetness he couldn't explain. He froze in place. It smelled like bread. The thought hit him so strongly that his throat tightened. Back on Earth, his mother used to bake bread on Sundays. The whole house would fill with the scent, and as a boy he would sit by the oven, waiting for the crust to brown. That smell was home. That smell was family. And yet here, on a planet dozens of light years away, surrounded by alien neighbors and metallic air, it was impossible. Nobody baked bread here. Nobody even tried. Humans barely had the right ingredients, and the aliens had their own strange foods, full of spices that tasted sharp and bitter to him. Still, the smell was real. He turned his head, following it. His steps carried him down the hall, closer and closer, until he found the source. It came from the unit across from his. The door was cracked open, and steam drifted out in soft white wisps. He hesitated at first. After all, barging into a neighbor's home wasn't polite. But his curiosity was stronger than his manners. Carefully, he leaned closer. Inside, he saw her. Soraya, his alien neighbor. She was tall, her silver skin catching the light in a way that made her look like a sculpture come alive. Her violet eyes were fixed on a tray she had just pulled from a strange oven device. She wore a loose garment that shimmered faintly, like woven starlight. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't her appearance. It was what she was holding, a tray of something that looked exactly like bread. Steam curled upward, carrying that scent, the scent of earth, of his childhood, of home. Daniel didn't mean to make a sound, but a small gasp escaped his throat. Soraya's head turned quickly and her gaze locked onto his. For a moment there was silence, just the two of them standing on opposite sides of a half-open door, the smell of bread between them. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, careful, as though she was choosing each word. "Hungry?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard. He wanted to speak, but his throat felt tight. No alien had ever offered him food before. Most of the Veyari, her people, kept to themselves. They were known as distant, logical, uninterested in the small emotions that humans carried. They shared walls with humans, but rarely lives. Yet here she was, standing with a tray of bread that smelled like earth, asking if he was hungry. He gave a small nod. Her lips curved, not quite a human smile, but close enough. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Then come." Daniel hesitated only a moment longer before stepping into her unit. The air inside was warm, carrying not just the smell of bread but other softer notes too. Soups, spices, attempts at dishes he couldn't name. For the first time since he had arrived on this world, Daniel didn't feel like he was on an alien planet. He felt like he had walked into someone's kitchen, and when Soraya placed a piece of the bread into his hands, Daniel realized something even stranger. He wasn't just hungry for food. He was hungry for connection. Hungry for something human that had been missing for far too long, and somehow, against all odds, it had come from his alien neighbor. Daniel sat at her table that night, unsure of what he was doing. He had stepped into her home almost without thinking, drawn by the smell, and now he found himself in a place he never thought he would be. Soraya's unit was small like his, but different in every detail. Where his walls were plain and dull, hers were lined with delicate cloths woven with patterns that shimmered when the light touched them. Strange crystal bowls rested on the shelves, filled with dried herbs and powders. The air hummed faintly, with warmth from her cooking device, and the table between them was made of some smooth metal that reflected their faces like a mirror. But what truly mattered was what lay on that table. A loaf. A loaf of something that looked almost like bread. Daniel reached for it slowly, his hands almost trembling. Soraya watched him closely, her violet eyes calm but searching, as if every movement he made was an answer to a question she had not spoken. Aloud, he tore off a piece, the crust still warm, steam rising faintly. He bit into it. It wasn't perfect. The taste was slightly different from earth bread. Sweeter, softer, with a faint metallic tang beneath it. But to Daniel, it was still bread. It was still the closest thing to home he had tasted in years. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "It's good," he said, his voice low but full of sincerity. "It tastes like home." For the first time he saw Soraya's lips curve into something very close to a human smile. Her silver skin caught the light as she tilted her head, almost shyly. "That was the idea. I studied your recipes. Humans find comfort in food. Warm. Food means warmth of heart, yes?" Daniel let out a soft laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Something like that. You did more than study. You managed to bring Earth back into this room." Her gaze softened, but she didn't reply immediately. Instead, she placed a second dish on the table. A kind of soup, faintly green and steaming, with pieces of bread floating inside. "Eat," she said gently. "You work long hours. You need strength." He hesitated for only a moment before dipping his spoon into it. The flavor was strange, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. It carried a brightness that cut through the heaviness of the bread. He smiled faintly as he ate, and Soraya watched him the whole time, as if each spoonful gave her some kind of answer she had been waiting for. Dinner that night was quiet, but not the kind of silence that felt empty. It was the silence of comfort, of presence, of two people who didn't need to fill the air with endless words. When he finally pushed his bowl away, Daniel leaned back and exhaled. That was better than anything I've eaten since I got here. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't name. You eat only the packets, yes? The ones they sell in the depot. He nodded. Yeah, they're fast, easy, but they don't taste like anything. They don't feel like anything either, she said softly. Her words surprised him, because they were true. He had been living without taste, without feeling, without the warmth that came from sharing food with someone else. He hadn't even realized how empty it had made him. That night, something changed. After that first meal, dinners became a habit. At first, it was once or twice a week. Daniel would come home tired, and instead of heating another dull nutrient, pack, he would see the light under Soraya's door and smell the warmth drifting out. She would invite him in, and together they would share her strange versions of human meals. Some were closer to the real thing. Her second attempt at bread was nearly perfect. Others were less successful. Her pie had a filling that was so sharp Daniel nearly coughed it back out, though he tried not to show it. But when Soraya tasted it herself, she wrinkled her nose and actually laughed, a sound he had never heard from her before. The failures didn't matter. The taste didn't matter. What mattered was the table. Each meal was no longer about food alone. It was about the way she leaned closer when he told her stories of Earth, about how her violet eyes softened whenever he laughed, about how she always placed the largest piece of bread on his plate without saying a word. And for Daniel, who had lived in silence for so long, the sound of her presence was worth more than any flavor. That night, as he left her unit, he realized something. This wasn't just about cooking. This wasn't even about bread. It was about sharing. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was no longer eating alone. Days turned into weeks, and weeks quietly folded into months. By now, Daniel no longer needed to wait for the smell in the corridor to guide him. It had become routine, almost natural. After work, instead of going straight to his own cold and empty unit, he would find himself walking towards Soraya's door. Sometimes she had already set the table. Sometimes she was still cooking, moving gracefully in the small kitchen, her silver skin reflecting the soft glow of the stove. Either way, he was always welcome. At first, Daniel thought it was just about the food, but slowly he began to notice things that had nothing to do with bread or soup. He noticed the way she tilted her head when he spoke about his childhood, as if every word was a treasure. He noticed how she leaned in slightly, closer than necessary, when she placed a dish in front of him. He noticed how her eyes lingered on him longer than most people ever did, her violet gaze calm but filled with something unspoken. And he noticed himself changing too. He found himself waiting all day for the evenings, when he could sit across from her. He caught himself smiling at work, remembering the way she laughed when her pie experiment had gone wrong. He realized he was eating less during the day, saving his hunger not just for her food, but for her presence.